Science Institute, where they were looking at supporting e-research on campuses. And so he did a lot of research and discovery, sort of at the same time we were doing so with the Freedman Center. And so what we wanted to do is give him a chance to talk about his findings through that process as well with the partners on that program. And I'll let him introduce the program and those people.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk through the process because I think it'll help people that are in the room that might be investigating where they're heading as well. And then sort of our findings, and you'll see it'll closely tie in also to the white paper that Roger proposed earlier, and we'll continue the conversations. So we had 3 people that made up the library team for this ARL Institute, and we were required to have 3 people that were committed from September to December last year, and at least one person had to be from outside the library. So I'm the team leader for research services, which is all the librarians that are responsible for maintaining the collections and adding to the collections, doing traditional reference, doing library instruction, and also working with the faculty. And then I also have a background previously where I worked in a corporate library for a few years where I saw this collaboration happening all the time. Because you often hear in the academic setting, well, I can't put out my idea, someone will steal it. Or, you know, this is mine until I'm published. But in the corporate setting, people would come into the library and we would make those connections immediately. Someone would come up with a topic or a need and we'd say, oh, well, we just found that for Bob last week. Have you talked to Bob? And we would call the meeting of the scientist and the business person or the marketing person, and the idea would just blow up and they would just go gangbusters on it. So I've seen it work. So it was interesting going through this process through this institute. Yuning Zhang is our chemistry and biology librarian. She's got extensive graduate work in chemistry. So she was able to speak to the graduate and faculty relationships that develop and add that perspective to the research. And then Mike Kenny, we made him wear a lot of hats, and he had to decide which hat he was wearing at one time. So he represents the faculty, so he could speak to the faculty research process that those in the library might not have a lot of knowledge about. We have knowledge of different parts of it, but to see it in its entirety, we might not have always been involved. He brought in a perspective and a Q&A to the interviews that I'll talk about, where how does e-research tie to the classroom? At least at Case, and I imagine a lot of universities, they tend to separate research and instruction, and they want to have these 2 different silos going on. And so through having this team approach and through our interviews, the types of questions we asked, we started seeing the benefits of e-research in the classroom and how that affected students. And Mike's also works with the campus IT, so we had the technology perspective as well. So I think through this team we've created, we were able to bring in viewpoints and not put those views out into the interviews, but ask questions that maybe got to things that, you know, one of us by ourselves we couldn't think of until the conversations happened. So as Roger said, we participated in this institute. It was DuraSpace, ARL, and DLF. They love all these acronyms. And just so if you don't know all these acronyms, DuraSpace is a nonprofit focusing on preserving scholarly and cultural record. And then the Association of Research Libraries, Council on Library and Information Resources, even though not in the title, was involved in the earlier institutes. I think this was the 2nd or 3rd one. And then, of course, the Digital Library Federation. They were mostly done by webinars, and the idea of the institute was to provide us the tools to do this planning, to ask the questions, to determine who should we be speaking to, what should we ask them, how do we relay these messages around campus. So the institute wasn't to tell us how to start e-research on campus or how to teach people to be e-researchers, but to ask the correct questions and start developing our own plan for our case community. So we focused, they used a lot of e-science examples, only because e-science is more, it's out there heavily in literature, there's a lot of grant dollars there, you know, there's experts there, but it was designed, the institute was designed that we could take those principles and use it in humanities and other areas. So no way was it focused on just e-science, even though it was called the E-Science Institute. The first year they did this, it was solely e-science. And they realized working with the universities that participated, That made no sense because there wasn't even an eScience team of collaborators that was all scientists. They were bringing in a lot of perspectives, so why limit it to solely eScience? The idea was they walked us through these 3 stages. First, we had to set our own baseline. Who's doing eResearch? What departments on campus and centers are supporting eResearch? Where's the research dollars? What do people think about eResearch? What are the policies related to eResearch? All these questions, bringing it together in one place. Then we had to start developing our building blocks for the future. How can we connect these things? How can we build on and offer a service that fills a gap? What are these connections that if they had a little help, they would be working together? And finally, developing an actual agenda, not just for the library, but for the university. This recent eScience Institute was 22 organizations, and there were several Ohio participants as well, including Miami and Cincinnati, and Ohio State had participated before. So we've already been having conversations within the state because we have the same background now of where are we going, what's out there, and so that's been interesting. But you could see the sampling of some of the universities and other organizations. What was nice about this is it wasn't universities just like Case. All different sizes, focus levels from just being traditionally an undergrad to a full research university. There were several medical organizations. Then we had like the Research Council of Canada. We had a lot of different perspectives. We all had the same problem. And we were all trying to develop our own ideas when there was already people out there having these conversations. Then they pulled in a lot of experts from some of the universities that are well ahead in this process, but also some of them had participated in past institutes, and they came back and told us, well, after we went through the institute, here's the things we started doing on campus, and here's how it worked or didn't work, or here's what our next steps were. We went through a series of steps to get to this. First, we had to collect all the case-related data, which is a pretty easy process for librarians to do. But then a large part of it was a series of interviews. So we had to find out who are the people we should be talking to, who are the people the library maybe hasn't had conversations with. Who are people that are doing eResearch that aren't coming up in these conversations, and then they walked us through a series of steps where we had different conversations either in the library or elsewhere, and most of this happened outside the library, which was really nice. It was bringing in a lot of perspective from out the library. We weren't pushing an agenda. We wanted to hear what are the needs. And then walking through the traditional things that many of us participated in, doing an environmental scan, doing a SWOT analysis, those type of tools. What did the library gain out of this? Well, we gained a greater understanding of the research process. So asking these questions and sitting down with a researcher, we learned a lot about what is from the initial idea all the way through to the publishing. But also, it was neat. These interviews were often only set for 30 minutes. It was quite regular. They would go an hour, hour and a half, and then people would look down and say, oh, I got to go to my next meeting. I'm running late, because they were picking up a lot of insights as well. We gained a lot of perspective that we didn't have previously in the library. We did do some interviews in the library, but majority of the interviews were stakeholders outside the library. So if I had a snapshot of what we learned in 2 sentences, this is sort of how I whittled it down. eResearch, however you define that, is vague and undefined around campus. It's very confusing. Almost every interview started with, what do you mean by eResearch? Even though we sent them a little insight of what we were doing, what the institute was. We even gave them sample questions. These are the things we want to tackle. But if you want to take the conversation another way, great. We want to hear those things. But almost every time it was, can you define eResearch for me? And then also we quickly learned that the library is positioned in a great place to start drawing these lines to all these centers, these researchers, these needs. And we were already doing it in a lot of areas, but not everyone knew, or they didn't see the library in that role until they talked to someone else like, oh, well, you did that for him, and oh yeah, now I see it. So it was very interesting. But like I said, every interview started off with this confusion of, what do you mean by eResearch? This is not a traditional term. I don't use this in my discipline. We're not hearing a lot of conversations in this area. And it was often maybe they weren't involved in eResearch themselves. they didn't have that personal history, or it just wasn't the terminology within that discipline, which was often the case. And so we started talking about other things, and then it sort of connected, like, oh, now we can have a conversation. And it often went to someone would understand what e-science was. They had heard about that, or they participated in it, or possibly digital humanities. They understood that, and then it broadened out to, now I see what e-research means for the whole university or the profession or whatever. Often the conversations also funneled back to the data life cycle of their research. That was something they could quickly relate to. And when they thought about that instead of e-research, this generic term, it made perfect sense of where players were on campus, who was involved, where the library fit in, where the collaborators fit in, and it started really pulling it together for them. And all these, we didn't force the conversation in any of these ways. We asked questions, and it turned into a conversation, and it always tended to come back to some of these things. This is actually an image from the eScience Institute, sort of documenting a data life cycle. The Institute was not designed to focus, even though it was all libraries, to focus on just the traditional roles of libraries, but to look at the whole perspective of research and start thinking about, where's the library now? Each library, your own library. Where could it be? Where should it be? What parts of the data life cycle, if you're not involved, we should be involved, or we should know about? So this is one of the which was a wrap-up session in December after we did all the interviews. And when they gave us to this, we said, oh yeah, our interview for this person, oh, we talked about these areas. In the interview with this person, we saw this, or this person went through that whole thing, and now this visually, that makes perfect sense what they were talking about. They also, typically, the faculty or the administrators related it to things they experienced every day. And they wanted to tie it into to something that there were consequences directly with them. They would tie it back to NSF standards or NIH standards that they were familiar with or they heard about, or it was related to their funding or complaints from faculty, whatever it was. They would jump back to these sticky points that they could relate e-research to. Making a data management plan. And then they would also jump into conversations about, well, you know, the formal publication process. I know how to publish. I know peer review. You know, I don't see the connection, or, you know, the publishing industry is not allowing me to go that way. And they would start going down that kind of conversation. Or they would tie it to their tenure process for their department or the university or academia as a whole, of where they thought e-research fit or didn't fit. And as a couple of the other presenters, it might have been just a large generalization about the tenure process or a specific experience they had, or they didn't know where someone that had done e-research had progressed through the tenure process. And then also, which I guess I wasn't expecting as much from these interviews, was how would e-research and the results of e-research funnel to the classroom? Whether it be teaching students to do e-research, or taking the results of that e-research and redoing the curriculum around that new product or that new data source or that new style of research. And early on, that was not a perspective I was expecting. They also spoke to the things they knew or they thought they knew about. These were the things that if you were going to ask them, well, what are you an expert in, or what have you already decided about e-research? So they were pretty comfortable in the types of data they needed to collect to accomplish their research. The goal of their research that was in mind right now. Maybe not how it could be adapted or how it could reach a new audience, but they're tied to that grant or that project. They knew that data for that moment of accomplishment they were looking for. They knew how to evaluate the information within their own subject expertise. They knew how to store it for their personal needs, not thinking about who might need it after them or something like that. They were totally tied to, I need to store it to get to this paper or this presentation or whatever that goal was, but not thinking beyond that typically. And they understood the formal publication process, you know, and they often would tie it back to, well, I need to get it published in a book or an article, and they would go back to the traditional publishing model. So to to talk about some of the things that came up throughout these interviews, and these were campus administrators tied to research or technology. These were just faculty researchers. We even had some interesting conversations that we initially didn't think of, talking to people in like development, because what comes out of eResearch has great ramifications on how they could speak to the university or what relationships they could develop outside the university. So that there was some a person in development that we spoke to that we originally, when you say eResearch, oh, why would you talk to a development person? But these are some of the things that came out of those conversations. There was some knowledge of eResearch projects around campus. There was examples people could speak to. But there was a lot of sticking points on the terminology. Many people seem to understand what e-science was, or typically. Most were not sure about digital humanities unless they were, for example, one of the Freedman Fellows or someone that had a specific conversation at some point about digital humanities. But outside a very small group, that terminology just, no one knew what it meant. A couple terms that seemed to make sense, and people in the interviews seemed to find it that it wrapped around everything and they could really speak to it a little better, was the eResearch or the digital scholarship. They seemed that encompassed all disciplines, and they could start developing ideas of what that meant to them or their research. Often on our campus, and I've heard it from other universities, you always hear this, well, I can't do this because the money's divided this way, or the administrators are divided this way, or policy won't let me do it for whatever reason. You hear it's in silos. And we've heard that, and I'm sure many of you have heard that times. But talking through these interviews, no one saw that as the issue. Because we've already got all kinds of examples of projects and efforts that have already bypassed all the silos. And so even though we heard some of that early on in some of these conversations, later on it was, people were like, no, you know, yeah, there's silos, there's challenges, there's red tape and whatnot you have to get through, but that should not stop eResearch from moving forward. And to really push it, the people we interviewed said there has to be some campus-wide definition and process to move this forward, or we'll have little people doing little projects everywhere, and no one tying it together. And without any prompting from us, because we rarely spoke about the library in these interviews, we were taking a very broad, above the library perspective of just eResearch. Most of our interviews, without any mention of the library, said, well, the library has already broke down many of those boundaries when it comes to research and collaborating, and there's a history of the library doing that. And if the library can help tie these researchers together or provide the tools, that makes perfect sense for eResearch to continue. People weren't always aware of what tools or resources were already all over campus. We would talk to one interview and we'd get a department or a center or a service or money, and then we talk to another one, they'd have totally different tools or resources or people. And so we ended up with after we'd done, we had this long list of other people we should speak to, resources that are out there, projects that are going on, but not one person could speak to even a small percentage of it. The other thing people struggled with is this idea of what's the value of my research. When they're going through the tenure process, they say, well, if I get that article, that book, you know, I know where that's going, you know. And then if other people follow up on the research, they could see the value there. But they were really struggling, defining the value of their research. It was clear talking to people. People said we have to move forward in eResearch, us as in case. And we might not be totally ready with the resources and the staffing and the expertise, but it can't wait. And we can't wait for others to define what eResearch is or how to do it to move forward. That we just have to jump in and with partnerships throughout the university, start coming up with some of these solutions. There's already restrictions coming that if things aren't defined and resources and expertise provided, it's going to start harming research, including the restrictions placed by granting agencies of, you know, how you document things, how you preserve data. So the researchers are at a point that are like, they know something has to happen. And they're looking for the people to start pushing that process forward. Also, everything we're doing is becoming more data-driven. So even if it's not even the formal research that'll lead to publication or whatnot, everything's becoming very data-driven in decisions, and these tools and techniques all wrap around that as well. There was some expression of lack of knowledge or understanding of some of the things related to the library. So Digital Case, the Freedman Center, the Research Services Librarians that we abbreviate RSLs. They knew what they were. They heard about the different services offered, but often it wasn't, they didn't know when to come ask that question of, you know, or come and say, I need help, or what questions to ask to initiate this collaboration. That was not clear. They could look on the website and see a service we offered, or they could see the email that went out or something. So we took away from that we need to approach how we consider collaboration very differently. It can't just be marketing our services, but actually jumping into the collaboration so that they don't have to guess what the questions are to get that process rolling. We're already there, and we can proactively make suggestions. We can come up with some solutions before they realize they have that problem, and they've went down the road where they've developed a project that, like a couple of people had suggested, you have to redo the whole project to move it to the next step. And they always went back to, there's changes coming. They don't know what the changes are. They're scared of the changes, including publications, assessment, where research dollars are coming, where tenure requirements are going to be. And one or more of these combinations have sort of scared them from this idea of e-research because they're looking who's already doing stuff. They really don't know. And then in the conversation, as they're thinking through answering our questions, they start thinking, oh yeah, well, that professor did that, and that department did that. Oh, I didn't think of that as e-research. And they had some of those ideas in their head, and they hadn't made the correlation themselves, which was quite interesting. We also heard how assessment and outcomes are measured all varieties, all totally differently all over campus. And how does that play into e-research? So is there some standardization? Is there ways to tie that this assessment means this if you look at it in this view? How do those things play together? The faculty, the interviews weren't really sure on what that means. One person also said, you know, we're in a survey generation. There's data constantly. And again, that data is being looked at what the research need is at this moment, you know, today or in the next week or two. And they're not thinking, how can that data be used again in the future or for other people? So they need some guidance to what are the other opportunities for that data, or how could it be made available to other people? Something interesting that came out of the conversations, and it actually came out of several people we spoke to, is how to tie e-research back to the undergraduate education and opportunities. CASE promotes itself as a research university. Come to CASE, you'll get an opportunity to do research. And if incoming students or potential students or families aren't quite sure where that research is or what's being done, that might sway a student to consider another university. So it has direct correlation to being an opportunity to get that new incoming undergraduate and keep them. And so if we can bring e-research together, so one, people are clear of what kind of research is going on, who are the collaborators, what are the results, what's the value of that research, it directly plays into the undergraduate recruitment and retention of those students. And that's at least the perspective that many of us in the library probably haven't tied early on into research. And many of the people interviewed said, well, there's lots of opportunities for storing stuff, whether it be discipline specific or organizations, but they're total at loss of how do I display data. They're just, it's the few people that have some ideas, they found an example and they just want to copy it. But they're not able to think through other ways of displaying the data. There's not that expertise that they can go around and get, and they're looking for that sort of guidance and expertise. So the next step through this eScience was to start creating opportunities for the library and others on campus, not just the library, because the idea with this was, the library does not have to do everything, the library doesn't have to lead everything, who are our partners, and so this is some way we sort of broke down some ideas, and you will, when you get a chance to read through the Freedman Center white paper, or if you look at the posters, you're going to see a lot of these come into play. So we broke it down into several categories. First one is the traditional data management or curation category. And these were ideas that came out, and some of these came directly from the interviews. They said, somebody on campus has to do this. And so it wasn't us sitting down and making a list, well, here, we could do this, we could do this. These came out of the interview saying, who does this, or can you do this, or can you teach somebody to do this? So the idea of having templates available for data management plans already out there, or having an expert available. Making sure data plans and other e-research aligns with all the other policies that exist. We heard from several of the interviews, well, I don't even know what the university's policy is in that area, so I don't know if I aligned with the university's record retention or the intellectual properties. Maybe implement something that's already out there and just promote something that exists. The DMPTool gives you templates for data management plans, and you can just fill in your information and work off that template. Things the library already does with metadata, so creating and managing existing metadata. But a big part that came out in the conversations was we would love to learn where that metadata comes from. Why are you creating it? How is it created? What are some of the processes? I don't want to do it all, but if I could understand some of that, then it will help me define my e-research moving forward. Educating those around campus. So educating students, faculty, and researchers about the entire data life cycle. But also focusing on undergraduates who aren't experiencing that early on, and maybe they're getting it in their graduate education or their career path once they're out of the academic setting. Starting early on in settings where the undergrads can start understanding how you develop this research process, that you're considering data and other things early on, and then that would bleed out to other areas of research and faculty involvement. Looking for active areas of collaborations. We came up with this long list of faculty who are doing things that we can approach and say, teach us or explain to us what you did, or is there some way we can help you? As Brian mentioned, not only do they want to know what's in it for me, but they often want to know what are the questions I need to ask my other collaborators. So if we can help provide some of that guidance, that helps build this new group of collaborators around a project. So the idea was, target a few faculty members or a few centers, run with it, show what's possible, show what's successful, and grow it from there. Outreach and support from the library, so marketing what we do, all the how we can support, so the research services librarians, how can we early on get involved in the research before it's considered e-research, or before they even know it's going down that path. What information can we learn about the faculty members' research or the center or the department that we can feed back to, for example, the Freedman Center, and they could say, oh, wow, well, that looks like a great opportunity. Or we can feed back to others on campus, and we could start building some of these collaborations early in the research process. And then the traditional scholarly communication, educating, copyright, author rights, and as Roger had laid out earlier, the Freedman Center. What will the Freedman Center look like and be staffed, and what technology will it offer to support these areas? Also looking at our facilities and tools that are available. So a lot of conversations came up in the interviews about visualization tools or being able to display data. All they kept thinking was the traditional article or the traditional book or a blog. They were starting to get towards E, but they couldn't jump unless they had already saw somebody that did it. And then, as I said, they sort of just want to copy that and put in their data. And so they needed some of that guidance. And also something that came up in the conversations, and it ties in directly with the University of Cincinnati example, is Who are the collaborators? How do I find partners? What's already happening? Who's getting the research dollars? Who is looking for partners? Who are some of these external partners? It tends to become, this department has these partners, this department has these partners, but how can we start crossing some of the departments? Whether it be an internal database of that knowledge or leveraging some outside tools that sort of, the tools out there that, for example, collect research knowledge, and you could start making some of those connections. This came up in 2 or 3 of the interviews, and it's not something when we went into this conversation, we weren't thinking of that collaborative aspect. We were thinking, well, how do we store your data and how we display your data? And they said, no. Something we really need is how do I find my partners? So this is an example that came up during the eScience Institute. One thing we heard so often was, well, publishing hasn't changed, so why do I have to change? We heard that before this process and just general conversations. And this is an example we received in a workshop we participated in from Nature Publishing that shows you how eResearch is changing and how drastically it's changing even recently. So in 1953, the Human DNA, they had 1 article in Nature with 2 authors, 1 figure, and no data. Nothing. So that's it. 2001, so almost 50 years later, there was now 62 pages, 150 authors, I think you would consider that collaboration, 49 figures, and now 27 tables of data. So quite a drastic change in how it was presented, how it was shared, and where this research is going. About 10 years later, the 1000 Genome Project had 12 papers, 76 institutions. They stopped counting authors at this point. It was too big. And over 12,000 IDs in this database of data that's now developed. And then a couple years later, another example, 30 papers across 3 journals. There's no way one person could keep track of all that. There's no one way one person could do all of that. It required collaboration. So there's even the publishing industry has adapted in certain areas, and we need to take some of these examples and start getting them out into maybe other disciplines that are thinking, well, we can't change. This is the way we've done it. There's examples out there we can show them, well, if your project goes this way, you're going to have to tweak it a little bit. You're going to have to try something new, and here's one example. And I thought it's a good example of how eResearch is just exploding and collaboration is changing research. So what was interesting is, Roger and others in the library were, looking at what the future of the Freedman Center is. And the group that I was working with, we were sort of doing big picture outside the library. And we came back to a lot of the same conclusions, which was good because we didn't want the future of, digital humanities and Freedman Center just to be the library says you're going to do it this way. We wanted to hear what's needed, where are the gaps, tell us if you think there's library shouldn't be in a part of it, tell us that. Give us that information. So this is just a sentence from the white paper. Freedman Center for Digital Scholarship has well-positioned libraries to provide a unifying structure and serve as the incubator and hub of campus activity that supports the university's strategic directions in research, innovation, and academic excellence. And both of these initiatives largely came back to the same spot of the Freedman Center, the library is that hub, and we're already making the connections, but we need to define it better. We need to organize around it. We need to see who else needs to participate, and market and share that knowledge with other people so that it can keep growing. So with that, we have time for questions, and if you have any questions for the other participants too, they'll be glad to join in. And I did learn it's nice not to be first because everyone quotes you in their presentations if you're first. So any questions or comments?
When you conducted your interviews, did you use like a standardized set of questions, or were these just appointments that you made and they were just like, hey, let's talk about eResearch.
Yes.
Go.
So what we did is we gave them just a few sentences of what we were attempting. What's this institute? Why are we doing this? And then we did have a couple questions that we have asked of everyone, like how do you define eResearch, or what do you know about eResearch? And then depending on the person or the role, we did have different types of questions. So one thing that was nice for the Institute is they gave us potential starting questions, and then we could customize them for our environment. So, and we often would send those questions in advance. We didn't want people to sit there and go, well, tell me, and then just sit there and wait for them to come up with answers, because we wanted a conversation. So we would feed them those questions early on. A couple of the interviews, we even recorded them. We got permission to record them so we could go back to them. We transcribed our notes and shared it with our colleagues here in the library using Google Docs so we could keep building off those. Like I said, typically we set 20 minutes to 30 minutes. Some of them were immediately, oh, 30 minutes, gotta go something else, but often it was an hour, hour and a half. And we also made sure there was always at least two of us present, so that you had different perspectives on the notes and you caught different things that were being said that, you know, oh, I think they meant this, and what do you think they meant? So that was helpful as well.
I guess I can't avoid commenting that I just told Arnold that the thing that I thought was really missing from the white paper was, by God, you have to go out there and sell it. That one of the most important things to do about digital scholarship is to make sure that, unlike many things at this library, people do know about it. And so thank you. I would like to comment, however, that I think you did not appropriately exploit the Human Genome Project, because the Human Genome Project, as it impacts biological research, is really not a publication at all. It is a huge searchable database and really completely not a publication, and that did not come through.
And that we didn't use that in any of the interviews or conversations. That was just something we picked up in the Institute of an example of how publication is changing beyond the traditional, and where eResearch is heading. So that wasn't used in any of these conversations.
I was wondering, you ran into a lot of folks who weren't familiar with the term eResearch. What was your quick explanation of eResearch to those folks?
We typically would give them examples we had heard of on campus already, and to see if they have known about them. Many of them seem to relate to eScience. Like we'd give them some other examples of, well, what about this terminology? Often they've had conversations or read about eScience, but not eResearch. Digital humanities, that hardly ever resonated with anyone, except for the exact people that were speaking up for it. So we would try to give them alternative terms. We didn't really want to define it because we want them to define it through the interview. So we tried to avoid defining it and just gave them some examples and let them run with it.
All right, thank you, Brian.